Well, good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's plenary session, which is all about asset stewardship and looking at emerging trends, current issues and opportunities that are happening in that space. My name is Ross Piper. I'm the CEO of Christian Super, a fund that is obviously deeply and actively involved in this particular space, but I'm joined by an esteemed panel, and one of the benefits we're going to have this afternoon is a truly international and domestic perspective to this discussion. And so to introduce our panel, we have Larry Beeferman, and Larry is a fellow of Labour and Worklife program at Harvard, based in Boston. Arrived yesterday, apparently not suffering too many effects of jet lag, so welcome, Larry. Beside Larry, we have Claire Molinari, and Claire is the Manager of Research at ACSI, and Claire will be able to give a good domestic perspective on many of the things we'll speak about. Beside Claire, we have Fiona Reynolds. Fiona is the CEO of the PRI. Don't be fooled by her Australian accent. She's currently London-based, but will be able to give, again, both an international and a good domestic perspective. And last but definitely not least is Rakhi Kumar, and Rakhi is the Senior Managing Director, the Head of ESG Investments and Asset Stewardship at State Street Global Advisors, also Boston-based. So please welcome our panel. So I don't need to tell you that asset stewardship is a very live and current topic of discussion across all aspects of the industry. And many of the topics, in fact, that we have heard from in other panels today and yesterday have highlighted the convergence, if you like, of investment choices and decisions, and what it means when we consider the long-term value of the places that we're investing, and how that is actually converging then with consumer sentiment and demand, particularly on the back of the Royal Commission, where as an industry where engagement is one of our biggest challenges, if there's any silver lining on a Royal Commission, that it's at least for a moment Australians who read the paper or listen to the news are thinking about where their money is and how it is invested. But what is the role that asset owners and asset managers have in terms of stewardship around those things? In this afternoon's session, we're going to be exploring a number of themes around that particular area. As with all other panels, I would encourage you to please send through questions. Slightly different panel in that we won't actually be hearing a speech or an introductory set of comments. We'll all be seated, and we want to create hopefully as much space as possible for a good dialogue, both across the panel, but equally to be hearing from you as the audience. So please send through your questions, and I'll build them into the conversation that we are having there. So on that basis, let me throw to our panel to get just some brief opening comments around 2 or 3 significant current or emerging issues that are influencing the focus of asset stewardship. And I'll open with Rakhi. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here. I see 2 trends that are going to be influencing the way we practice stewardship. First is the growth of index and quant strategies that have raised the question of how stewardship is practiced and how it's integrated with all the investment strategies. And so it will be for us as asset managers to demonstrate impact that we are having on through our stewardship programs. And the second one is the commitment to TCFD, which has really focused engagement on climate and climate-related issues.
Great. Thank you, Rakhi. Fiona?
So, I'm going to come at this from a slightly different perspective and looking at the growth of responsible investment more broadly than just on the engagement. So I think if it's 2 or 3 things. Well, if I think about the last 10 years, I think the biggest influence has been the global financial crisis. And even though that seems a long time away to some, it's still having impacts on many people today. And I think that really made people think about how to manage money in a different way. But I think more recently, where we've seen a huge growth in responsible investment in the last couple of years, from our perspective, it's really been driven by the signing of the Paris Agreement on climate change and also the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals that really do provide a good framework, that governments have agreed on about what are really the issues that that we all as governments, but as business, as investors need to address.
I think that one thing that's changing at the moment is that we're seeing increased focus from members on a lot of ESG, environmental, social and governance issues. So, for example, we're seeing lawsuits around climate change. We're seeing regulators step in to speak about climate change from sectors that you wouldn't necessarily have expected 10 years ago. And I think that, in fact, funds are doing a lot of things on ESG, but sometimes the communication of exactly what's happening is not getting through to members. And I think that there's going to be an increasing focus on really communicating what is happening in ESG to members.
Well, my comments, I'm going to characterize them as slightly grumpy and somewhat abstract. The abstract, I don't know who said it, but academics were like for philosophers, people who walk with their heads in the clouds and convey themselves into a ditch. But that apologies. Just stepping back, at least flag a few points. I think the good news, as far as from my perspective, was increased visibility and attention to activism framed as ESG, responsible investment, long-term investment, and so on, and many more players involved, and that's been the good news. But I think the issue on the flip side is at the extreme, I would call it a babble of definitions and terminology, issues of a lack of transparency, both in definitions as well as methodology, and the result can be incompetence or fraud at the extreme. And those are risks that come with where we are, I think, at this particular time. So that's one set of issues. I think lurking under some of the conversations are tensions between a discourse which is framed in terms of materiality, the financial risk and reward, and normative considerations. And I think that has to be dealt with more. It's below the surface. And I think I was going to flag also, I think, given what I've just said, I think the issues of, I'll call legitimacy and accountability, the relationship between members and what funds are doing in this sphere makes it especially important to deal with the questions of what's communicated and how they understand it.
Great, thank you. So to pick up on this issue of engagement, I think there's a number of issues for consideration for both asset owners and asset managers in that space. And so, Fiona, could you give some commentary on the question, how do asset owners, so whether directly or indirectly through asset managers, decide what is the subject or the prioritisation of an engagement? And related to that, how are the outcomes of that engagement? What are you seeing in terms of how that is communicated to relevant constituencies, and any examples where you'd see that's working very well, or areas where there are gaps or learnings?
Well, I wanted to pull out a few things from our reporting framework. So any investor who's a signatory to the PRI has to report on an annual basis on their activities, including on their stewardship activities. So we have the biggest data source in the world on responsible investment activities. And so it does sort of tell an interesting story globally. And Rakhi also already mentioned the whole issue of the rise of passive. And from our perspective, being a passive investor does not mean that you can't be an active owner. In actual fact, you really need to be an active owner when you're more and more in passive, because it's really the only option available to you to really manage risk. But when we look at it this is globally I'm talking about, when we look in our reporting framework around these issues, we find that there's 30% of our signatory base, and these are supposed to be the most active people in the world, who have no formal engagement policy in place at all. We also find that asset owners, which won't be surprising to this audience, really prefer collective engagement and doing things collaboratively, whereas investment managers prefer to do it on their own and don't often get involved in a collective. We've also find that nearly 50% of our asset owners base their voting recommendations on the recommendations of their service providers. And among the asset owners, less than 75% of them review less than 5% of those recommendations. So they mainly take them holus bolus from what is recommended to them. That compares with the investment managers, who review about 30% of the recommendations made to them. But there also seems to be a disconnect a bit between the asset owners and the investment managers. Many asset owners rely on their managers to do the voting for them. Yet less than 5% of investment managers, when we talk to them in our reporting framework, say that they follow any instructions from their clients on voting or engagement. So the numbers really don't match up at all from what asset owners are saying is happening and what investment managers are saying is happening. So to us, this means there needs to be much more oversight from asset owners around what their investment managers are doing about engagement and voting. Even if they're not voting on your behalf, you can still find that there's a mismatch between what you're voting and then how your managers are voting, and that's another source of contention often within our industry. And I think the other thing where asset owners are outsourcing a lot of their engagement is often the learnings don't come back into the investment team. So the engagements are outsourced. I've done the engagement, I know that it happened, I've ticked the box. But what happened with that engagement, and how do you bring that back into the internal or the external investment team? And I think that's an area where we need to do a much better work, because at the end of the day, it's the portfolio managers who are making a lot of the investment decisions, if not all of them. And if they're not picking up all of this engagement work and discussions with companies, etc., then it can be a little bit of a waste in some regards. I think in terms of, you mentioned about how people come to their decisions about what are going to be their major issues, that varies a lot. Sometimes it's a lot about issues that are important to the board in different jurisdictions. Sometimes it's about what came out of the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. So what are people saying are the major risks that we're facing? And in other countries, it's very much driven by the beneficiaries, where there's really good beneficiary and pension fund dialogue that happens.
Right. Rakhi, you've just been out here engaging with a number of pension funds and obviously have a global perspective. Do you want to add to the thoughts on engagement?
Yeah, I think Fiona's really captured some of the differences that we've seen. I can tell you globally and here in Australia, the oversight on asset managers when it comes to their stewardship programs is on the rise. And here's where some asset managers differ. And as you're thinking about how to oversee your asset managers, you really want to think about what their program offers for you. So it's very often people want to have the exact same program, whereas some of our global clients, like especially in the Nordics, they actually see us as a complement to their existing plan. Most investors are very good at their domestic engagement and voting because it's their market, and they leave it up to the global managers to do global engagement voting. And so often what we do is we have a transparent discussion about what our priorities are going to be for the next year, and then they have an idea of where we're going, and they also feed into what they're looking at, so we can either consider that year or in the following year. What I would like to add is what do you do in terms of prioritizing? How do you prioritize? And it really depends on your goals and objectives. So we have two very core beliefs when it comes to boards and ESG. The boards is we want boards to be strong, effective, independent. Can't check the box on that one. And then the second one is we want these boards to incorporate sustainability into long-term strategy. And underpinning those two beliefs, we pick topics. So for example, and we have thematic and sector. So as an index investor, every year we pick up 3 sectors. They change every year, and the idea being in a 3 to 4 year period, you've gone through your entire portfolio. Thematically, we picked topics that are really relevant to our entire index. So not very specific company-specific topics, but themes that will be playing out in a company-specific way during engagement. And so those can range from corporate culture, which is a thematic focus for 2019, to board accountability in the annual election cycle or not, and then also climate change. And these keep changing, I think, less frequently. And finally, I would also like to talk about impact and calculating impact. Impact and making change when it comes through engagement can take a long time. So you have to have patience, and it should be a multi-year viewpoint. In some cases, you get it immediate. Here in Australia, with the 2-strike rule and the spill, you actually get pretty significant change. But is that change meaningful? That is still being debated in the market. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and it comes back to Larry's comments earlier around concerns or risks and the question of accountability or transparency. But let's change gears slightly. We've got some questions coming through. Just a reminder, Arena 1, please forward them through and we'll feed these to the panel. But there was a session earlier today where there was some discussion around the role of fiduciary, and is that changing over time from, I guess, both a moral, ethical and a true investment lens. Larry, can you give some perspective or comments to that? Do you think the traditional definition of a fiduciary is changing? If so, in what ways?
Well, as I had led a learning lab session earlier in the day in which certainly I tried to trace, certainly in the Anglo-American context, which is the notion is most relevant here, of the understanding of fiduciary duty and its relationship to trust law. And I suggested, that it was a mismatch from the get-go, that it misunderstood, I think, the relationships which underpin retirement plans, particularly defined benefit plans, which were different from those structures. So I think in some ways what we're seeing today is the recognition or acknowledgement that there isn't that fit, for that reason alone. Second, as I mentioned, because of the shift from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans, which almost by definition, given the way they're designed, involve issues of member choice. The notion of choice and fiduciary duty, it's almost a contradiction in terms. Because if you're fiduciary, you act for someone else. But if you have choice, you act for yourself. So already the model has changed for that reason, especially insofar as defined contributions have emerged. Of course, there are generational issues. As suggested the ESG session earlier, younger people particularly are concerned about a broader range of issues. And I think they're tied in more or less subtle ways. The discourse about the purpose of enterprises, corporations, okay, that discourse and the struggle over that is bound up with the understanding of fiduciary duty as it's framed in the retirement plan concept, and that's in process of being a new understanding.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add to that? I mean, we've done a lot of work on fiduciary duty in the 21st century. So we take the view that you cannot possibly be meeting your fiduciary duty if you don't consider environmental, social and governance risks that are material. And so there shouldn't be any thought about, oh, it's okay, I can if I want to. Think about ESG issues if my fund happens to be interested in it, that, it should be in law that you must, and we've tried to work really hard around the world about trying to get the must in and having some success, but not in every country. I think the whole issue is that people, planet and profit have to be aligned. One cannot come at the expense of the other. And it is a whole ridiculous notion to say that you are going to save money for people's retirement, but you are not going to think about the world into which they retire. And at the end of the day, every investment that you make has an impact, and it's up to you as an investor to decide whether that impact is positive or negative. But there's only two ways to go. It's either positive or it's negative. And we're actually taking the work that we've done on fiduciary duty now to another step. We're just doing a big research project on this to say that it's not even enough just to consider ESG factors. We want it to go the next step and to say that you must consider the impact of your investments and starting to work on how you measure that impact. So I think, again, in different countries, this is going to another level, particularly in Europe. The US is at another level of fiduciary duty. Sorry, Larry and Rakhi, but you are. And they're more in the thinking at it through a very legalistic lens, but then the government's not very friendly in the US to these issues at the moment either. So.
Great, thank you. I'm going to keep us moving so we cover some broad areas. And a question that's come from the room, and I'm going to pass it to Claire. We all talk about negative screening, pulling money out from things that we don't want to invest in, or positive screening or active ownership. You might have heard an example in the US, in fact, where there were an order of nuns who took a stake in one of the firearms manufacturers, and this, of course, became known as the nuns with guns narrative. But the whole sense of actually we want to actively advocate for and influence change. And so question for you, Claire, is there a role for asset owners to become activist investors to achieve organisational change or transformation for poor behaving or poorly operating companies?
I think it comes back to the idea that asset owners are investing money in the best interests of their members. And the money can't be used to achieve an activist purpose. It has to be used in a way that is consistent with fiduciary duty. So you need to think about, is what I'm doing taking into consideration environmental, social, and governance issues, for example. That's a good that is going to promote long-term performance of companies that you invest in. Investing in taking an activist position, you need to really think carefully about whether you're actually acting in the best interests of the beneficiaries. That's what we've seen in the legal cases in the past, and there's been a lot of work on how what fiduciary duty allows now. So I think that you just need to look very carefully at the purpose of your investment.
There are some examples in Australia, in fact, where there are investment options, not so much in the pension space, but where folks can actually directly target their investments in products that do exactly that. Almost activist investors, but clearly they're making a choice to do that. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about culture. Culture has obviously been explored in a number of ways over the last few days. There was some recent press in Australia in the Fin Review about an investment manager called WCM in the US who have been very successful stock picker, but interestingly, they pick their stocks based on culture. So companies that, in their view, have great culture will ultimately perform better than benchmark. And so there's obviously been an ongoing focus on corporate culture, but looking through the lens of asset stewardship, what do you see? Are there links here? And I'll ask Claire initially, and then maybe, Rakhi, you can add to this. Are you seeing culture as a factor in asset stewardship?
Yeah, so I recently went out to all of our members to talk to them about what they would like to see ACSI focusing its research agenda on for 2019, and culture was something that kept coming up. I mean, it's been a perennial issue for years, particularly in the financial services sector and particularly following the Royal Commission. And the things that members were saying to me, two things. One, this is a really nebulous concept, it's really difficult, but two, we really should be taking the first steps towards addressing it. So ACSI meets with the ASX 200 companies. We meet with directors of those companies, and we're looking at, first of all, we are asking them how they're addressing measuring culture and trying to influence their culture, and we're looking at having a more formal research piece that will make a start on how to address culture.
And Rakhi, I believe you guys have done some research.
Right. So we actually, in our 2019 thematic priority letter that we send out to global companies, including ASX 100 companies, our CEO, this was the theme of our CEO's letter to the company boards. And we attached a guidance piece on how we would like boards to look at culture, and it was a simple framework. It really starts with strategy and understanding what is the culture that is needed to help support the strategy. And the reason we start with strategy is because in today's disruptive world, that's the first thing boards go to keep businesses alive and try to adjust to the changing dynamics. And so what we found is that often boards and companies are very good at talking about strategy and trying to pivot strategy without evaluating if the culture is going to support that change. And we found that there can be, if culture is not synced up with strategy, you can either have a delay of achievement of strategy or the strategy can fail significantly. And so the reason we brought this up in a systematic manner is we don't know if we have the answer. It's just that we're hoping that we start getting boards to think about their role. And I will say we've been discussing this with companies globally, and initial reaction of boards are a little bit of panic, because they really have to figure out a narrative around how they're overseeing strategy, and some of them don't even know what their role in overseeing it, because there is this tension of who actually can effect change. And often it's management who has to implement change. But I think, so what we've told boards is review it in the context of reviewing strategy. That's the first thing. The second thing we also tell boards are that, culture is an intangible asset. And if you think about today's valuations of companies, most of the companies are being valuated, over 50% sometimes as intangible assets. And you always have to think of, is the culture of this company sitting on the asset or the liability side of my balance sheet? The third part about culture is you really can't pass judgment on what's good or bad. Because you may say, okay, but words, every word, nobody's going to say I have bad culture. They'll always say, I have a collaborative culture, etc. But every good part of the culture or good word has a negative effect. So collaborative sounds good, but if to the nth degree or pushed to the nth degree, it could lead to poor decision making and low accountability. So boards and companies need to balance where culture is at. And this morning's session really dive deep into culture, and I thought they made some very good points, including the fact that culture has to keep changing, because you have to make sure that you don't tip over to that bad part of that culture, the positive cultural element or change that you're trying to make. So we think we're at the start of a journey. This year we are learning and listening so that we can come up with more of a framework to identify in a systematic manner what really makes companies tick when it comes to culture.
And I just think that culture is obviously essential. If we look at the Royal Commission, and it won't be news to anyone in this room, it's really that culture of entitlement, that culture of putting yourself first and your remuneration first rather than your clients, that is where all the rot sets in from the Royal Commission, and what then stems from that by having bad culture. So I think, culture is absolutely essential.
So culture as an investment and a stewardship issue.
Yeah.
Let's keep moving. Again, thank you for the questions. Please keep them coming. Arena 1 on your app. We're going to talk a little bit about climate change. It's been, again, the subject of some discussion in earlier sessions today, but in particular, and I'll ask Fiona to provide some commentary just on what you are seeing in terms of the asset stewardship themes around climate change. Are the current collaborative mechanisms, there's lots of work going on around collective action, are they working? Learnings, issues, observations in that regard?
So within our signatory base, climate change is the number one issue. It doesn't mean the other issues aren't important, but it does mean that it's the one that people see as the most urgent to address. And it's the one we definitely see as the most urgent to address. So we put out some research late last year, which we called the Inevitable Policy Response. And basically, the thesis behind it, trying to put it simply, is that, the IPCC report says that we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The current commitments under the Paris Agreement take us to over 3 degrees, and lots of research shows that we're actually heading above 3 degrees, some to as high as 6 degrees, which is just not able to happen. So therefore, our view is that in the not too distant future, that governments will have to bring in emergency measures, policy measures, and that these policy measures will have significant impacts on financial markets. And the message really behind the work that we've been doing is, you need to act now on the whole issue of climate. So one of the biggest issues we've been working on with a whole lot of other groups is Climate Action 100+, and I think it shows the benefit of collaborative engagement. So over 300 investors, 32 trillion in assets under management. It's the biggest ever investor collaboration that's happened with corporates ever in the history of the world on any issue, not just an ESG issue. And it's focusing on the 100 largest emitters in the world. And it looks at three things. So it looks at, first of all, obviously at emissions reduction, so how companies are making those emissions reductions and over what time frame. It looks at the board, importantly, because with the transition to a low carbon economy, have boards actually got the right people on them now? Do they have the skills? Do they understand the issues of climate change? And then the others around disclosure about what companies are actually doing and in line with the TCFD recommendations. And I think there's been some really significant impact. So we've had, BP, Shell, Glencore all make commitments to invest in line with the Paris Agreement, so at below 2 degrees. Glencore's not going to be expanding its coal production. So, look, some of these things, I wish some of these companies would go further, but I think it's a really good starting point, and they are engaging with investors. But I don't think they would necessarily do that if there wasn't huge coalitions. I think they'd be ignored. I think in the US, we've had a little bit of a different experience. So one of the companies that we're engaging with, and there's shareholder resolutions being filed, is with Exxon. But Exxon is challenging the shareholder resolutions with the SEC, and they're citing micromanagement from shareholders. So a very different approach from, again, the European-based companies to the US-based companies on the engagement stewardship and engaging with investors and the outcomes as well.
Thank you. A question that's come from the floor, which is an interesting, poses in some respects a philosophical question or dilemma. I'll pose it to Larry. Clearly across respective constituencies or member interests, you're going to have a range of views when it comes to ESG type issues. So the question is, how do you reconcile the interests of these members with ESG if your constituents have diverse views around this particular issue?
No, I think it's a legitimacy issue. I think within some limits, in a defined contribution context where there's choice, then at least you have some ways of acknowledging the preferences of particular members in terms of at least the general character of the investments and the approaches that they are taking. But I would say I don't think there's any quick and easy answer to that.
Could I just add that the UK is just updating its stewardship code, and there's new regulations that are coming into place for pension funds in October this year, and part of what you will have to do is show that you have consulted with members. Now, you as the board are still going to have to decide what you do. It's not like that because one member, 5 members said this, that you have to go and do it, but you have to show that you've done it. And same with the new regulations that are coming in the EU. You will still need to show how you have consulted with beneficiaries. So I think there's going to be a big change.
So if I could just try give my perspective as to how we have many clients with different needs, and often you'll hear from the few very vocal clients, and that can drown out the quiet clients who may or may not care about certain issues and are not talking to you about issues. So I think first, the perspective we've taken is a fiduciary responsibility. So if we can't understand how an issue is a value driver, and as a long-term investor, we probably have not understood the topic well. So I think we also try to understand it's the investments that we are managing for long-term returns, sustainable long-term returns. And so I think what helps is just to understand and have that debate internally to say these 4 or 5 core topics are of interest and of value generating to my beneficiaries or my client base. And then it's up to you to communicate to your client base why this is creating sustainable value and why you're focusing on that. So I think, it's very tempting to go into a proactive stance when it comes to complaints, but I think the best response is an offense is the best defense, as they say. And I think doing this proactively, understanding your positions, taking a position which is clearly articulated in the benefit of for the eventual beneficiaries or how it benefits it is the right way to go about it.
Claire.
Yeah, if I can just hop in with one thought in the Australian context. ACSI launched an asset owner stewardship code last year, which is it's a set of principles that asset owners sign up to, and demonstrate how they are applying the stewardship code. And I think having that sort of framework in place that makes it really clear to members how you think about these issues is one way of sort of just communicating and putting some borders around what you think is important and why and how you're dealing with it as a fund.
So we've got a question from the floor which resonates with one of the themes we wanted to explore. And the question is, how long will it take for investment culture to change so that it is inclusive of women or gender? And so, Claire, can you expand on the theme of gender diversity and also just ethical conduct, again, and the role that asset stewardship can play to influence positive change in this regard?
So ACSI for several years has been one of its key things that it's been engaging with companies on is gender diversity at the board level, so trying to get Australian boards to have at least 30% women on them. And we see it really as part of a broader issue, which is trying to improve the talent pool, because women make up 50% of the population, and if they're only a tiny proportion of directors, then you're not really getting that broader talent pool that you need to. We think that over time, diversity, we should be looking at a wider range of factors as well. But we're really pleased because over several years, we've gotten to a point where they're almost, the ASX 200 has almost 30% on average female directors. And we would like to see diversity improve more broadly. I think one of around ethical conduct, I mean, I think getting good directors, good people on boards is part of leading from the top and having that better conduct. And part of that is maybe looking a bit more broadly across the pool of Australians, across the pool of potential directors out there. So that's an area that ACSI will be focusing on in the future.
And I think the other issue is there's been a lot of focus on women on boards, as there should be. You know, the OECD average is only 21% of women on boards. But more concerning than that, which is concerning, is, you know, if you look at Fortune 500 companies, only 5% of women are CEOs. And then so a lot of cases where you're getting the board members from, they look at CEOs. Who are people who have been CEOs? Can they then go onto a board? So unless we're getting more women there, they're still into the CEO positions, there's still a blockage on gender diversity. Or we have to get people to think more holistically about, well, how do I reach down into some of the other senior ranks of organisations to look for good women who can be board members as well.
Yeah, so if I could chime in, this has been a really difficult thing to get a hold of, because you start, and we have a call to action also on gender diversity, which has been successful. But what we've done is we've seen gender diversity quotas in Europe, right? And we saw that many senior women, once they hit a certain rank, actually leave the workforce to become professional directors. And then companies are starting to go into, how do we retain those women? How do we then it also becomes retaining younger women who are childbearing age, etc. And I think that 3 dimensions on gender diversity that as a society we need to address. Organizations can address 2 of the 3. One is organizational diversity commitments and team level, because no matter what you do, employees will only relate to what their manager does for them. So organizational diversity is important, but how it's practiced at the team level is important. And then the 3rd dimension is the societal expectations and the biases that really influence women in their decision-making, their careers. And so there was a research by Korn Ferry about, and they interviewed female CEOs. And many of the 65% of the female CEOs said they had never considered being a CEO till someone told them they could be CEO. They also said that they had a tremendous, they had to really figure out if this was the right career move for them because of the cost that it would. They knew they would have to have a personal cost, especially their family would have to bear a personal cost. And that dilemma they had to play out. And they could only do it if they felt there was a greater purpose or there was something important that was going to come out of it. So we need to understand how we're currently practicing business, and I'll give you an anecdote. My colleague was, somebody from London office came and invited us out for dinner to catch up, and my colleague responded, I'm a working mother. I cannot do working dinners. I'm happy to meet you for lunch. And it's that kind of calling out and changing how we're socializing that may be needed for us to even remotely have the dream of achieving gender parity in the workforce.
Okay, so again, thank you for the questions that are coming in. There's been a lot of conversation around the Modern Slavery Act and discussions going on across a range of different platforms in that. Can anyone on the panel just comment on, with the enactment of this Act in Australia, how much influence do you think this will have on funds investment policies?
So we just commissioned a piece of research on the Modern Slavery Act, which looked at giving practical advice on companies as to how to report in line with the Act when it comes in. I think it will be what funds will need to do is look really closely at the reports that companies are providing to understand how they're managing risks around modern slavery. And then make decisions from there. I think we'll probably expect there to be enough reports on modern slavery by sort of mid-2020 to start forming a picture of how well companies are doing. One of the nice things for Australia is that internationally in the UK there's already been some reporting on the Modern Slavery Act, and I think there's been some benchmarking. So there's, in a sense, we'll have an advantage because we'll be able to understand whether there's been enough action by companies in the area, or whether the performance is not good enough, and that funds need to think about having a serious discussion with companies about the performance. But I think we need to wait and see what comes back from the reporting.
So we've got a session on this tomorrow. So I'm chairing a global commission through the UN on modern slavery and human trafficking, only looking at it from the financial services lens. And one of the things that we need to see is more modern slavery acts in place, and that's something that we're working on. So we're looking at it through three lenses. So we're looking at it from the anti-money laundering side. You've got to follow the money, and people who are engaging in these issues need to launder their money somehow. Then we're looking at it from the investment point of view into the supply chains, which is obviously a major problem. And then we're also looking at it from a financial innovation perspective. So how can you really provide those that are vulnerable, that are unbanked with banking services, so that they've got better access? In the UK's had a Modern Slavery Act, as Claire said, for a while. And I think one of the things that it has done is brought attention to the issue. And the government's really committed to the issue, I have to say, in the UK. If you get off the plane, the airport, the first thing you'll see is advertising about modern slavery, and you'll see it all around. But while it's drawn attention, it's a bit of a compliance. So I have to do a statement about modern slavery and put it on my website. So the Australians, I think, have gone a little bit further, which is good. So we just need them to go to another level of real action. That's not to say that there aren't some companies who have done some really fantastic things, but yeah, it's a bit tick the box, I think.
Yeah, it's fair to say, I think, even that it's early days, as Claire has said, in terms of just trying to understand implications for that. But certainly some learnings from the UK and elsewhere on that.
Yeah.
We're almost on time, but I have one last question. I'm going to throw it to Larry first, and then others may wish to comment. Again, this has come from the floor, but so the S in ESG is often the poor cousin of ESG issues. How do you see that changing?
Well, I was going to actually raise that point because certainly I've spent a lot of time, actually starting around 2010, on the labor workplace issues, and that's been laboring in the vineyard for a long time, and it's only within the last year or two, at least that dimension, labor and human rights issues that it's really started to come to the fore. And that what brings you back to my earlier point. I don't have an answer, but I guess I'm troubled by the question that in fact that the issues that we're talking about are on the screen are not in the first instance driven by materiality considerations, despite the discourse about materiality. They relate to the social movements and the organizations which have brought those issues to fore. They come from outside investors' activities. And because of reputational risk and other issues, that's why I think they get on the agenda, and then you have an overlay of materiality on that. So I think which issue will emerge in part depends on all the other social forces. And I think what you have at the present time is the turning attention to, quote, human capital in a way because there are other organizations in civil society that are pressing on that issue. But I think we will see definitely more of that activity, but it's a long slog.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists like to comment on that?
I would say that I respectfully disagree that it's not material. I think the biggest disservice we've done is called ESG non-financial. It's just that we don't know how to value that risk because our risk frameworks and risk, the way we look at risk is has not caught up with the new risks that are emerging. But I would say human capital is definitely the next big thing that all investors are going to have to grapple with to understand how to engage upon, but also evaluate how companies are managing human capital. And what we found is that when you start talking about culture, human capital is very closely interlinked. So with a focus on culture, both here in Australia and abroad, you're going to have S emerge as the next big thing.
So for the last 2 years, we've had more S issues that we're dealing with than E and G, and we're really trying to push the S issues. From this year, we're trying to build a normative framework for incorporating human rights, because so many investors, some do it, and then others just forget about human rights altogether. Human rights, of course, is inclusive of labour rights, and we need to make it that all investors consider them, and that's our next mission.
All right, so on that challenging but somewhat optimistic note, we're going to conclude. Just before we thank our panellists, just a reminder, if you could please rate the session on your app. And as has been the case with other sessions, a gift has been donated to the First Nations Foundation. Yes, so please join me in thanking our panellists for what's been a very rich discussion.
Thank you. Somehow I've got this in my hand.